Welcome to Adorama Voice, a voice for creators. I'm your host, Daniel Norton, and we got a great episode this week. I'm effectively answering a question that was sent in to me via email by Paul about gear. Now, I know that I've been on social media lately, kind of with some fun memes and stuff about, oh, you're talking about gear again? And now I'm going to talk about gear, but I'm not going to talk about it in the, this is the new blah, blah release. I'm going to talk about it in more of an abstract way and how gear affects us as photographers and that thing we often hear, hey, you have a great camera. So let's get to it. Okay, so let's talk gear. Okay, so this was inspired by an email I got actually from Paul. So I'm going to read the email first, and then I'll talk a little bit about my thoughts, and we'll kind of deep dive into how important is the gear. Hello, Daniel. I'd be interested in your thoughts on working professional photographers seem to use the latest, best equipment available to consistently produce their work. Social media photography influencers tout the philosophy that one can be creative with any type of gear and produce good work, which is also true. However, observing these social media photography influencers over time, they will generally be using the greatest gear available. In your experience, have you observed that working professional photographers, those that actually make their living from photography, primarily use the latest, best equipment to accomplish their work? Thank you, Paul. This is a great question and something that comes up a lot. We get the, you have a great camera when somebody sees your pictures, stuff like that. Or you get the, you could make a great shot with any camera. You don't need that if you're a true artist. And I mean, I think all of that is kind of true and for different reasons. And I think once again, we have to look at value not just as the cost of something or the number of megapixels or a very strict number, but the value in several different ways. So I want to kind of break this down in the value emotionally that you might have, the value as far as technically, and then the one that I think is probably the most important for working pros is the value based on reliability. So we'll dive into each of these. I'll talk a little bit about why each one might be important to you, as a creator, and why they might be important to me, and why they might be important to somebody making their living with their camera. Okay, so I'm actually going to talk technical first. The value of your gear can be defined by what it's got, right? What features it has. Maybe it can do 8K video, maybe it can do time lapse, maybe it can do slow motion, maybe it can shoot multiple frames per second, maybe it's very good at shooting in low light, meaning that the higher ISOs have less noise. Maybe it has the brand itself has many accessories or features available, lenses and such that could be useful to you. These technical aspects might decide why you want to buy a certain piece of gear, and it may make or break a shot, right? If I want to go out and shoot, let's say on safari or shoot birds or something like that, I may want a really long lens. And what lenses are available to my system? Which of these long lenses has really fast autofocus? All of these things can matter. So if you are looking at a photographer, let's say that's shooting for a publication and they're shooting birds, let's say for Audubon Society, they're going to want to make sure they get the shots, right? They're being paid to get out there. They're getting paid to get certain shots. They need to get these things. Then you might look at a really an enthusiast, right? At somebody that might be an influencer that gets possibly their money, but certainly their influence by putting out great shots of birds. If they don't put out great shots of birds, they're not going to get people to click on their images and they will not have the numbers that they want, right? So it's important to them that they have the fast autofocus and the good long lenses and stuff like that. So even though they might say, hey, you want to go out and shoot birds, you don't need this 800 millimeter lens and you don't need to go to these places. The reality is that to get some of those shots, you do. And that's probably why they use it. Does that mean you can't do anything? No. And I think that's where the line is, right? We've got this idea that you can create a great shot with any camera, but you can't necessarily create every shot with every camera. And this is where the value of the technology comes in. Wanting to have the, as you say, latest, greatest, because it does something that we need or we want to achieve the effect that we're going for. If I'm going to shoot food photography, for instance, and I want to stop a splash, when I'm dropping a strawberry into a drink and it's going to splash and I want to get a great shot, I might need really good flash equipment that has short flash duration to freeze that, right? I might even want to get some kind of a trigger system that will allow it to catch it perfectly every time, especially if it's my business. If I'm just trying to recreate the shot because it might be really fun, I could probably just use a really bright area of daylight and just wait for a good time, right? Or I could move my ISO up high to get those fast shutter speeds with the ambient light, even though it may not look as good and might not print as well, because it's still creating a fun photo for me. So can I create a really great splash photo with just a basic camera and daylight? Yeah, sure. Can I work as a professional shooting food, doing splashes and drinks consistently without proper equipment to do it? Probably not. And let's talk about consistency now, because I think this is important. Actually, I'm going to tell a little story before I do that. Let me go sideways here. So when I was a photo assistant in Miami, I worked for a photographer, and we did a lot of advertising stuff. And in Florida, a lot of times the shots, especially pharmaceutical shots, if you've ever seen a pharmaceutical shot, it would be this like older couple walking on the beach with a dog or something as the sun comes up. And that is half the time we shot that with like a 400 millimeter lens, nothing, like literally just a lens. But we brought cases and cases of gear out to the beach. We brought flash with long extension cords and batteries if we needed to use flash because the light wasn't correct. We brought warming filters and different gels to create the ambience that we needed just in case. We also brought silks and scrims and other things that we could use to control the light if the light wasn't exactly the way we wanted it, because let's say somebody was running behind or we had to do an extra take. So this photographer got paid a lot of money and had multiple assistants on the beach. And I would say maybe half the time we used a tripod of 400 millimeter lens, several cameras because we're shooting film, and that was it. Nothing else, none of the other gear. We set it all up and we waited, it was there. But the reason why we did that is because when you are a professional, you have to get the shot. So it comes down to a lot of times, do you need the technology because you have to get the shot? Or do you need it because it makes it easier for you? Or do you need it because you just want it? Because that's also a very valid reason to have a piece of gear. Can we become too dependent on the idea of having the best gear? Yeah, I think we can. And maybe that's a whole other subject. So let me keep moving on and maybe I'll circle back to that. So let's talk about a little bit of what I've been tapping at a little bit, which is reliability. One of the main reasons why professional photographers, as we're asking here, and I'm defining as professional as somebody who makes their living from it, that makes money from it, at least some of their living, they want gear that is reliable. They want gear that will work every time. So I might have a flash that I've had for many years and doesn't have, let's say, high-speed sync. If this is, by the way, if you're not a photographer and we're hitting some technical stuff here, I apologize, but I'll try to keep it as non-tech as possible. But I might not have a certain feature in my flash. But if I've used those flashes for 10 years and they're always reliable to me, and that feature is not something that I need, the technology part I was just talking about, then I don't need to be buying new gear. I don't need the latest, greatest if all they added was that. A good example for me, for instance, would be a lot of these flash companies now are adding brighter modeling lights to use. They say, hey, you can shoot video with them as well. Well, yeah, I actually do quite a bit of video, but I have video lights. So I'm not going to trade in my flashes to buy a flash with a bright modeling light that I could use for video when I already have those lights. So as a professional, I'm looking for return on investment, right? I want gear that's going to be reliable, that's going to work for me constantly, that's going to do the job so that I can get paid, right? And I want to buy gear as infrequently as possible. I don't want to be buying a camera every year. I want to be buying them as rarely as possible, only when I need them, because every time I spend money on a camera or a lens, that reduces my profit line. So do professionals always have the latest, greatest? No, not necessarily. But what they do is they often buy the most reliable gear they can. So when I go to buy a camera, or I buy a set of lights, or I buy a softbox, or I buy any piece of equipment, a computer, for instance, I'm going to buy as top of the line as I possibly can within my budget, within reason, because I want it to last. Not because I necessarily need all these bells and whistles, but because I know this top of the line camera is going to hold its value. I'm going to be able to have it for many, many years. And most of this stuff holds true for your kind of basic equipment. So you're talking about lighting, you're talking about studio equipment. Those things aren't going to change that often, even to a certain extent. Lenses, cameras are the thing you're going to upgrade the most often, and you'll probably see pros a lot of times with the newest cameras. But I think if you look through a pro's kit, they will have a lot of reliable stuff they've had for a long time. So latest, maybe not. Greatest, probably. Now, again, if you are an influencer and you are, collecting your followers and getting likes and stuff like that based on your sphere of influence, a lot of influencers are gear reviewers and stuff. So they're going to want the newest stuff, again, because for them, having the newest camera or the newest lens or the newest light will allow them to get more views on their video or listens on their podcast or retweets on their tweets. These things are going to get them that stuff. So for them, investing in the newest camera, oftentimes borrowing it, renting it, or maybe getting it from the manufacturer for a short period so they can have that newest stuff on their page. If you're following an influencer for their amazing photos, but then they're teaching you and they're using a 10-year-old camera, there is a disconnect there for a lot of people. So I think for your influencers, it's maybe more important. The more you're in front of the public, the more you have to kind of be up with the times, right? You don't want to be using old stuff when you're an influencer. Unless, of course, that's what your personality is. Maybe you're somebody who shoots with old cameras, right? That could be what you do. But again, I'm talking very general here. So if you are making your money from doing reviews and talking about new product, of course, you're going to use the latest. Greatest? Not necessarily. Probably most popular in that case. So you see how we have a little bit of a divide here. Your pro that makes their money from it, that shoots for a living, is going to want gear that's reliable and probably often the best, if you will. Influencers are going to want gear that is new and flashy so that it draws views. So sometimes these things overlap. In fact, many times they do. Okay, so let's talk about the emotional part. Now, for me, this is actually pretty important. For some people, it might not matter at all. And for some people, it's somewhere in the middle. And that is, I actually did a YouTube video about this years ago where I talked about, I was kind of jokingly, I pulled out this Polaroid camera and I was like, this is the latest, greatest camera. And it was actually a brand new camera. But the point being was that camera for me had an emotional and a retro, if you will, connection. And it got me really excited about shooting with it. It didn't matter that it was a Polaroid camera and the resolution and lens and this all wasn't the greatest thing in the world. It was just a really fun, awesome camera that got me motivated to shoot. This is often true for me. I'm the kind of person that likes to use different stuff. I come from a film background, meaning analog, where every camera kind of had a purpose. You might have a 35mm camera with a long lens to shoot sports. Then you might have a medium format camera and a portrait lens and shoot portraits, right? Like family portraits. You might have more of like normal type lenses and do a reportage work for your medium format or even a different medium format camera. Cameras had personalities and what you produced with them was very different. Nowadays, you can take your one really great mirrorless camera, shoot different, aspect ratios. You can put it into Photoshop and change it up. You can really mix it up and change it and do a lot with one single body. So the bodies to me become less kind of interesting. And now it really is just a box to me because it doesn't feel any different for me to use most of the newer cameras. That doesn't mean I won't use them and they're not awesome. They are, but I don't have that connection with a lot of them. So the emotional for me sometimes draws me to use some of my older cameras and keep them. Like, for instance, and this is a digital camera, I have a Leica M8, the very first Leica digital. And this camera is a crop sensor. It's only like 10 megapixels. It's slow, not just because it's a Leica and it's manual focus, but because you shoot like 3, 4, 5 pictures in RAW and then you have to like wait before you can shoot again. And all those things would be like, oh, really? But when I've used this camera, I've produced some of my favorite images and I use it for portraits. I love the way that it interprets the skin. It's not perfect. Like some of the newer cameras, it's not as clean, if you will, but it creates such a beautiful image to me. This imperfection, and we've talked about this in other things, this imperfection of the image is part of the perfection for me. And using that camera and having that experience of using that camera makes me create different types of images. This is also true when I shoot film. So I keep my RZ67 around. I keep my large format camera, view camera. Every once in a while, I bust those out and I shoot with them because they create a different feeling. Now, I talked about in the previous podcast, the idea of using like a 360 camera or your phone, because that creates a different feeling. But now I'm talking as a professional. I could bring somebody into my studio and say, hey, I want to shoot with my view camera. It's a slow process. It's really different. We're going to shoot film. And the whole feeling on the set is different. It's raised to a different level when you use different equipment. Sometimes that emotional connection can be what helps you get something interesting from your subject and really something interesting from you. And there's been some trends. Okay, so I just want to talk about a couple of things too here. So when I think about this, you can do anything with any camera. Back before digital really blew up, I mean, people were shooting digital, but there was a camera called the Holga. And many people might know about this. Let me know, message me or send me a message and let me know if you ever used one of these Holga cameras. But effectively, they were medium format, right? So, if anybody knows medium format, it's like, ooh, but they were made out of plastic. They were basically cameras that were designed, kind of like toys, effectively. But photographers were using them to create really interesting images because the plastic lenses created a lot of distortion and weirdness. There was light leaks. It was a little bit kind of messy, and they were really, really fun to use, and people love them for that reason. You could make really interesting shots with the Holga. That being said, you couldn't make any shot with the Holga. If you were hired to make a really nice formal portrait of somebody and you walked in and shot with the Holga as your only camera, they might be very disappointed if they're looking for something very specific. And if you decided, oh, no, I want to create a much nicer shot, you wouldn't be able to do it. The camera wasn't capable of doing that. So this might be true of, let's say, I don't know, maybe there's people out there, let me know, that have like old digital point and shoots or something, that maybe that'll become a trend. But the idea of the Holga was that you're creating this this kind of, I guess, retro, for lack of a better word, feel that's imperfect. And speaking of imperfect, I had a really good friend that was doing wedding video for a while, and he was shooting all Super 8. There was a trend a little while back. Maybe people are still doing it. Let me know if you guys know about this. And he was doing video coverage in Super 8. It was way more expensive to hire him to do that than it was to hire somebody with a beautiful DSLR or mirrorless camera or video camera to shoot your wedding in a really modern, crisp way with all the stuff. But some people wanted that retro look, and he would go in there and shoot and create these videos that were, like I say, much more expensive, for the consumer, but they loved the retro, they loved the imperfect, they loved the funkiness of it. And yeah, he was very successful doing that. So you can do that. And I've seen photographers that use film. I've seen photographers use film in different ways, meaning analog, where some of them do it and show the beauty of film, but some of them do it and it's kind of like, it's film, it's great because it's messy and you don't know what you're going to get, which I take a little like, and that's not really true, but the idea that like if you're shooting on film, it'll have a different feel is true, right? When I bust out a film camera and I photograph somebody who's not been photographed with a film camera in a long time, or maybe never, it creates a different emotional experience. Is the film camera, analog as would be, the latest, greatest thing? No. But is it going to help me create something more interesting for that shot? Yes. Do I use film sometimes in professional work? Yes. Do other people? Yes. So when you start talking about, does a professional always have the latest, greatest? That's old and maybe not great at all when it comes down to it, right? But if it creates a look that you want, then that's a reason to have gear. So gear can help you create a feeling, not just in the final images, because of course you can add film grain and light leak looking things and weird streaks in post in Photoshop, but it changes it on the set. When the person is there with you and you pull out this plastic camera and you explain to them that this is going to be messed up and might not work at all, it might be really weird, there's just a certain interest that is brought from that. And if you pull out the camera and say that and they give a face like, oh, really? Then you don't do it, right? But the idea is most people are super excited about that. And again, going back to my Leica, when I would go on jobs shooting portraits, I would always bring a DSLR, and these days a mirrorless, but I'd always take a few with the Leica because, again, I love the results from it. And almost always that was the camera that people would be drawn to. They'd be like, oh, that's such an interesting camera. And again, it opens up conversation. So can the emotions created by a piece of gear help or hinder you? Yeah, I think it can. So maybe that's part of the equation. So let's see if we can smush this all together. Now, you might not work professionally as a photographer. You might be a serious amateur. Maybe someday you would like to be a professional photographer and charge for it. Maybe not. Maybe you just want to be really good at your craft. So what matters to you? Well, again, reliability is so important to professionals. And so many times I hear this gear is almost as good as, or this gear is good enough. And people are buying, less expensive gear or stuff that's known to have reliability issues. And as a professional, that's probably not a good idea. Now, that being said, if you are starting out and your budget is low, don't feel like, and I always say this, don't feel like you cannot work unless you have the latest, greatest thing, or the greatest, or the most reliable. Just understand your gear so that if you have, let's say, a flash that sometimes doesn't fire, you just need to work that into your repertoire with your subject. When you take the picture and the flash doesn't fire, you just keep going, right? You don't want to freak out about it. If you have a flash that's inconsistent with color temperature, just know it's going to take you a little bit longer in post to fix it up. Maybe set your camera on auto white balance while you're working so they look decent at least, and then go in post and kind of tweak it all instead of setting it on a fixed white balance like you would do, let's say, with a more reliable flash. If you've got a camera that isn't great in low light, meaning it's grainy at high ISO, make sure that you bring with you enough light and work in that way, right? If you have a camera like my Leica that doesn't shoot very fast, well, make sure that you set the pace of the shoot like that. Don't come in motor gunning with it and then be like, oh, now we have to wait. Shoot slow, talk, interact. use the gear in the way that it works for you the best. All of this gear can work. What's important to a professional is that at the end of the day, they can get the shots that they're hired to do, and they can do it every single time. Will every shot be the best shot they've ever made? Not necessarily, but it'll be a well exposed, well composed, well shot image that people will like on some level every single time. And that's what's important to a professional. We just go over it all one more time. Influencers are going to want the latest, greatest thing because they want to show off that they're showing you the new stuff. They're looking for SEO and keywords and people to retweet. So they want to use the newest stuff for that reason. Photographers that are you doing it for a living are going to want stuff that's reliable. So not necessarily the latest, but definitely the best. And then all of us are going to want, on some level, things that we feel an emotional connection to or things that help us create our style. It may be that you use a very specific light that's not reliable and not, the greatest and could be really old, or a camera, because it creates a certain look. You might shoot with a Holga because you like the Holga look and people know that getting into it, and that's what you got. If that's your style and that's what you do, that's fine. If you are hired to do a shot that's not that, you need to either make it clear to those hiring you, or you got to change it up a little bit and rent a different camera or whatever. So there you go. That's my thoughts on this. I would love to hear what everybody thinks, especially those that do work professionally and those that maybe are influencers, right? If you have a YouTube channel or a podcast or a strong Instagram following, or you're trying to build it, do you try to get the latest gear for those reasons I'm saying here? If you're working professionally, do you strictly go reliable, or do you just bring backups? Because that's another option, right? You could buy something that's much cheaper and just buy two. I never think that's a great option, but let me know if you think that's a great option, I guess. You can call in. There'll be full information at the end of the show, but the simplest way is just to look in the show notes. You can send me a message on Anchor. Remember, it's only 1 minute, so if you have a longer speech you want to give me, you want to leave multiple messages. I want to thank Adorama for supporting the podcast like they do every week. You guys can support them by going to adorama.com and picking up any photo, video, audio, computer stuff that you might need. Also, check out adorama.com/create no matter what. There's always contests going on. You can enter in to win all kinds of gear. So thanks again to Adorama, and those links will be in the description. We have a great review this week from Graham. It's from March 10th, and this one's on Podcast Addict. Thought-provoking, down-to-earth, pragmatic, chock full of insight and anecdotes. A low-key, highbrow, and utterly riveting podcast on photography and philosophy. Well, thanks, Graham. I really appreciate reviews like this. If you guys have not taken a chance to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast distributor, please do so. These things are what helps push a small podcast like this one up in the algorithm and gets it in front of more people. And if you do review the podcast, I'll be reading one a week, so maybe yours will be the next. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks, Paul and Graham. And if you guys would like to have your voice on the show, you can send me a message via the Anchor app. Just click on the link below. Remember, those are only 1 minute long, so send multiple messages if you have more than a minute's worth of stuff to say. Or you could record a voice message, let's say on your phone, and email it to adoramavoice@gmail.com. You could also just type something out and ask me to read it. I will do that. Just specify that you want me to read it. Thus I will. You can find me on all kinds of social media, including Adorama's Discord. I'm on Twitter. All those links will be in the description, and I'll talk to you soon.